The scream pierced through the marble halls of the Mancini mansion at 3 a.m., sharp and desperate enough to make even the armed guards stationed outside flinch. Alessio Mancini, the most feared mafia boss in New York, stood frozen in the doorway of his 5-year-old daughter's bedroom, watching a scene that had become all too familiar, yet never easier to bear. Little Eloise thrashed in her bed, tears streaming down her flushed cheeks as she clutched her worn teddy bear named Mint. "The monsters! They're coming, Daddy, make them go away!" she sobbed, her tiny voice breaking with terror that no amount of money, power, or influence could chase away. But it wasn't Alessio who moved first. It was Clara Whitmore, the nanny who had arrived just 3 weeks ago, who rushed to the bed and gathered the trembling child in her arms. "Shh, sweetheart, I'm here. Feel my heartbeat? You're safe," she whispered, her voice like warm honey in the cold darkness. Eloise's sobs gradually quieted as she buried her face against Clara's shoulder. And then, in a voice so small it was barely a whisper, the little girl asked the question that would change everything. "Clara, will you stay? Will you stay? So my monsters leave?" Alessio's breath caught in his throat. In that moment, watching his daughter find comfort in another woman's arms, he realized that Clara Whitmore hadn't just become Eloise's salvation. She had become his. Welcome to Passion and Power, where love conquers even the darkest hearts. Tonight's story will take you deep into a world where a powerful mafia boss discovers that sometimes the greatest strength comes from the gentlest touch. Comment below where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button. Your support means everything to us here at Passion and Power. The Mancini estate stood like a fortress overlooking the Hudson River, its manicured gardens and imposing architecture a testament to the power wielded by the man who called it home. But for all its grandeur, the mansion held secrets that money couldn't buy away, secrets that echoed through its empty corridors in the form of a little girl's nighttime fears. Alessio Mancini sat behind his mahogany desk in his private study, the glow from his laptop casting sharp shadows across his angular face. At 40, he commanded respect from every corner of New York's underworld. His tailored black suit fit his muscular frame perfectly, the white dress shirt beneath unbuttoned at the top 4 buttons, revealing a glimpse of his powerful chest and the elegant tattoo that curved along the side of his neck, a reminder of the family legacy he carried. His platinum Rolex caught the light as he reached for his espresso, the weight of it familiar on his wrist. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made him look up. Mrs. Henderson, the head of household staff, appeared in the doorway with an expression he'd grown to dread. "Sir, I'm afraid we have another situation with Miss Eloise's care," she said carefully, her hands clasped in front of her. Alessio's jaw tightened. "Let me guess. Another nanny is quitting." "Miss Rodriguez packed her bags an hour ago. She said—" Mrs. Henderson hesitated. "She said she couldn't handle the night terrors anymore. That's the 5th one in 6 weeks, sir." The muscle in Alessio's jaw twitched. 5 nannies. 5 women who had promised to care for his daughter, only to abandon her when things became difficult, just like her mother had. "Where is Eloise now?" he asked, his voice controlled despite the fury building in his chest. "In her room with her teddy bear. She's been asking for you, but—" Mrs. Henderson trailed off, knowing as well as he did that Alessio's presence often made things worse. His daughter loved him, but she also sensed the darkness that surrounded him, the danger that was as much a part of him as breathing. Alessio stood, his 6'3" frame imposing even in the privacy of his own home. "Schedule interviews for tomorrow, and Mrs. Henderson—" He looked directly at her. "This time find someone who won't run at the first sign of difficulty." As the older woman nodded and left, Alessio walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the city lights below. Somewhere out there, people lived normal lives. They tucked their children into bed without worrying about enemies, about the weight of a criminal empire, about the legacy of violence that seemed to follow the Mancini name like a shadow. His reflection stared back at him from the glass. Dark hair perfectly styled, olive skin that spoke of his Italian heritage, and eyes that had seen too much. Those same eyes that could make grown men tremble with fear were powerless against a 5-year-old's tears. The sound of soft crying drifted down from upstairs, and Alessio's heart clenched. Eloise was awake again, probably reliving whatever nightmare had plagued her sleep. He wanted to go to her, to hold her and promise that everything would be all right. But how could he make promises he wasn't sure he could keep? His phone buzzed with a text from Marco, his right-hand man. Meeting with the Russians moved to tomorrow night. Kozlov wants to renegotiate territory lines. Alessio typed back quickly. Handle the preliminaries. I'll be there for the final negotiations. As he set the phone down, he caught sight of a framed photo on his desk. Eloise on her 4th birthday. Gap-toothed smile bright as she hugged Mint, her beloved teddy bear. She had been happy that day, truly happy. It was one of the few times since her mother's abandonment that she had seemed like a normal little girl. Sophia Mancini had left on a Tuesday morning when Eloise was just 2 years old. No note, no explanation, just empty closets and the lingering scent of her perfume. She had taken nothing but her passport and the diamonds he'd given her for their anniversary. The private investigators he'd hired found traces of her in Monaco, then Switzerland, then nothing. She had vanished as completely as if she'd never existed. But she had left behind a broken little girl who woke up screaming most nights, terrified of abandonment and shadows that only she could see. Alessio rubbed his temples, feeling the familiar weight of failure settling on his shoulders. He could negotiate million-dollar deals, eliminate threats with a single phone call, and command loyalty from hundreds of men, but he couldn't chase away his daughter's monsters. The crying upstairs had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow worse. Alessio made his way up the grand staircase, his footsteps muffled by the Persian runner. Eloise's door was slightly ajar, and through the gap, he could see her small form curled under her princess-themed comforter, Mint clutched tightly to her chest. "Daddy." Her voice was small and uncertain. "I'm here, Piccola," he said softly, using the Italian endearment his own father had called him. He sat on the edge of her bed, careful not to disturb the carefully arranged stuffed animals that served as her guardians against the dark. "The monsters came back," she whispered, her green eyes, so much like her mother's, wide with remembered fear. "They were in the closet and under the bed and—" "Shh," Alessio interrupted gently, reaching out to smooth her dark curls. "They're gone now. Daddy's here." But even as he said the words, he knew they weren't enough. His presence might provide temporary comfort, but it couldn't fill the void that her mother's abandonment had created. It couldn't give Eloise the nurturing, gentle care that she desperately needed. "Will you stay until I fall asleep?" she asked, her small hand reaching for his. "Of course," he replied, though they both knew he would leave as soon as she drifted off. He had calls to make, business to attend to, an empire to run. The responsibilities never stopped, not even for a father's love. As Eloise's breathing gradually evened out, Alessio studied her peaceful face and made a silent vow. Tomorrow he would find someone who could give his daughter what he couldn't: stability, comfort, and the promise that she would never be abandoned again. He just prayed that this time he wouldn't be disappointed. The next morning brought a parade of candidates to the Mancini estate, each one more polished and professional than the last. Alessio sat in his study, reviewing resumes while Mrs. Henderson conducted preliminary interviews in the main parlor. Nannies with impressive credentials, glowing references, and years of experience with difficult children filed through his home like soldiers reporting for duty. But as the hours passed, Alessio found himself growing increasingly frustrated. Each woman seemed more interested in the generous salary he was offering than in actually caring for Eloise. They spoke in clinical terms about behavioral modification and sleep training, as if his daughter were a problem to be solved rather than a child who needed love. "Sir?" Mrs. Henderson appeared in his doorway looking apologetic. "I'm afraid the last candidate just left. She said the position was too demanding." Alessio's hands clenched into fists on his desk. "Too demanding? She's a 5-year-old girl, not a hostile takeover." "There is one more," Mrs. Henderson said hesitantly. "She doesn't have the same credentials as the others, but her application was different, more personal." "Send her in," Alessio said, his patience wearing thin. At this point, he was willing to consider anyone who wouldn't run at the first sign of difficulty. When Clara Whitmore walked into his study, Alessio's first thought was that she looked nothing like the other candidates. Where they had been polished and professional, she was naturally beautiful in a way that didn't require designer clothes or perfect makeup. Her light brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her green eyes held a warmth that seemed to fill the room. She wore a modest blue dress that accentuated her slender figure without being inappropriate, and when she smiled, Alessio felt something shift in his chest, something he hadn't experienced in years. "Mr. Mancini," she said, extending her hand, "I'm Clara Whitmore. Thank you for seeing me." Her handshake was firm but gentle, and Alessio found himself holding on a moment longer than necessary. "Please, sit," he said, gesturing to the leather chair across from his desk. As she settled herself, Alessio studied her application. "I see you don't have extensive nanny experience," he said, his tone neutral. "No, sir, I don't," Clara replied honestly. "But I do have something else. I understand what it's like to be a scared little girl who needs someone to believe in her." Something in her voice made Alessio look up sharply. There was pain there, carefully hidden but unmistakable to someone who knew what trauma looked like. "I grew up in foster care," Clara continued, her hands folded calmly in her lap. "I know what it feels like to be abandoned, to be afraid of the dark, to wonder if anyone will ever stay long enough to care. I can't promise I have all the answers, but I can promise that I won't give up on Eloise." The sincerity in her voice hit Alessio like a physical blow. This woman understood his daughter's pain in a way that no amount of training or credentials could teach. "The other nannies left because of Eloise's night terrors," he said bluntly. "They found her too difficult to handle." Clara's expression softened. "Children aren't difficult, Mr. Mancini. They're just trying to communicate the only way they know how. If Eloise is having nightmares, it's because she's processing something that's too big for her to understand. She doesn't need someone to fix her. She needs someone to sit with her in the dark until she's ready to turn on the light." Alessio felt his throat tighten. When was the last time someone had spoken about his daughter with such compassion, such understanding? "I should warn you," he said, his voice rougher than intended. "This isn't a normal household. There are security considerations, guards, protocols. Some people find it unsettling." Clara met his gaze steadily. "I'm not some people, Mr. Mancini. I'm someone who believes that every child deserves to feel safe and loved, regardless of their circumstances." Before Alessio could respond, the sound of small footsteps echoed in the hallway. Eloise appeared in the doorway, clutching Mint to her chest, her dark curls still messy from her afternoon nap. "Daddy," she said uncertainly, her eyes moving between Alessio and Clara. "Come here, Piccola," Alessio said gently. "I want you to meet someone." Eloise approached slowly, her natural shyness evident as she half hid behind her father's chair. Clara didn't try to force interaction or speak in the overly cheerful tone that many adults used with children. Instead, she simply smiled and waited. "Hi, Eloise," Clara said softly. "That's a beautiful teddy bear. What's his name?" "Mint," Eloise whispered, holding the bear a little tighter. "Mint is a wonderful name," Clara replied seriously. "He looks like he's very good at keeping you safe." Something in Clara's tone must have resonated with Eloise, because she stepped a little closer. "He protects me from the monsters," she said, her voice barely audible. "I bet he does," Clara said, nodding gravely. "The best teddy bears are excellent monster protectors. Would you like to show me your room? I'd love to meet all of Mint's friends." Eloise looked up at her father, seeking permission. Alessio nodded, his heart racing as he watched his daughter take Clara's outstretched hand without hesitation. As they left the study together, Alessio heard Eloise's voice, more animated than it had been in weeks. "Mint has a whole family upstairs. There's Honey and Coco and Princess Sparkles." For the first time in months, Alessio allowed himself to hope. Maybe, just maybe, Clara Whitmore was the answer to his prayers. When they returned 20 minutes later, Eloise was practically glowing. She ran to Alessio and climbed onto his lap, something she rarely did when strangers were present. "Daddy, Clara knows about monsters too," she said excitedly. "She said sometimes they're just shadows that look scary, but aren't really there." Alessio looked at Clara over his daughter's head, seeing the gentle smile that had already begun to work its magic on Eloise. "Is that so?" Clara said she could teach me how to make the shadows into fun shapes, Eloise continued, like butterflies and flowers and— That sounds wonderful, Piccola. Alessio interrupted gently, his decision already made. He looked at Clara. When can you start? Immediately, if you'd like, Clara replied, her eyes bright with genuine excitement. Perfect, Alessio said, his voice carrying a note of relief he hadn't felt in years. Mrs. Henderson will show you to your room and explain the household routines. As Clara stood to leave, Eloise suddenly jumped down from Alessio's lap and ran to her. Clara, will you read me a story tonight? I would love to, Clara replied, kneeling down to Eloise's level. What's your favorite story? The one about the princess who saves the dragon, Eloise said seriously. Clara laughed, a sound like silver bells that made something warm unfurl in Alessio's chest. A princess who saves the dragon? That sounds like my kind of story. As they left the study together, Alessio found himself watching Clara's graceful movements, the way she listened to Eloise with complete attention, the natural warmth that seemed to radiate from her very being. For the first time since Sophia had left, Alessio felt like his house might become a home again. And as dangerous as that hope was, he found himself powerless to resist it. 3 weeks into Clara's employment, the Mancini household had undergone a transformation that bordered on miraculous. The oppressive silence that had once filled the mansion's corridors had been replaced by something Alessio had almost forgotten existed: the sound of his daughter's laughter. Eloise's night terrors hadn't disappeared entirely, but they had become less frequent and less severe. More importantly, she no longer faced them alone. Clara had moved into the guest room adjacent to Eloise's, and on the nights when the monsters came calling, she was there within seconds, armed with nothing more than a gentle voice and infinite patience. Alessio found himself looking forward to coming home in ways he hadn't since before his marriage had crumbled. The estate no longer felt like a beautiful prison. It felt like a sanctuary where his daughter could simply be a child. But Clara's presence had awakened something else in him, something far more dangerous than hope. Every time he saw her reading to Eloise in the library, her voice soft and melodic as she brought fairy tales to life, he felt a pull in his chest that had nothing to do with paternal gratitude. When she laughed at something Eloise said, the sound sent warmth spreading through his body like aged whiskey. And when she looked at him with those impossibly green eyes, he forgot for a moment that he was a man who dealt in violence and fear. It was a Tuesday evening when everything changed. Alessio had returned from a particularly tense meeting with the Kozlov family, the Russian crime syndicate that had been pushing into Mancini territory for months. The negotiations had been civil on the surface, but underneath lay the promise of war if boundaries weren't respected. He found Clara and Eloise in the kitchen, flour dusting every available surface as they attempted to bake cookies. Eloise stood on a step stool, her small hands covered in chocolate chips, as she helped Clara measure ingredients. "Daddy!" Eloise squealed when she saw him, abandoning her post to run into his arms. "We're making cookies for Mint's tea party tomorrow." "Are you now?" Alessio asked, lifting her up and noting the streak of flour across her cheek. "And how is that going?" "Clara says cooking is like magic," Eloise said seriously. "You put in love and sugar and flour, and it becomes something wonderful." Alessio's eyes met Clara's over his daughter's head, and he saw her cheeks flush pink. She was wearing jeans and a soft cream sweater, her hair pulled back in a messy bun with tendrils framing her face. She looked young and beautiful, and completely out of place in his world of designer suits and deadly secrets. "Magic indeed," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight that made Clara's breath catch. "We saved some dough for you to try," Clara said, her voice slightly breathless. Eloise insisted. "Did she?" Alessio set his daughter down and approached the counter where Clara stood. She handed him a spoon with cookie dough, and when their fingers brushed, he felt an electric shock run up his arm. He tasted the dough, aware that both Clara and Eloise were watching him expectantly. "Delicious," he pronounced, and Eloise clapped her hands in delight. "Clara makes everything better," Eloise declared with the absolute certainty of a child. "She makes the scary dreams go away and the house feel happy and—" She was interrupted by the sharp ring of Alessio's phone. He glanced at the screen and saw Marco's name, his expression immediately hardening. "I need to take this," he said apologetically. Marco? What is it? Boss, we have a problem. Marco's voice was tight with tension. Viktor Kozlov was found dead in his car an hour ago. 3 bullets to the head, execution style. Alessio's blood ran cold. Viktor was Dmitry Kozlov's younger brother, and while he wasn't directly involved in the family business, his murder would be seen as an act of war. Where? Alessio asked, moving toward his study. Outside his apartment in Brighton Beach. No witnesses but boss. Marco paused. Someone left a message. Mancini sends his regards. What? Alessio's voice was deadly quiet. I didn't order this hit. I know that, and you know that. But the Russians don't. Dmitry is calling for blood. He wants a meeting tomorrow night, and he's not coming alone. Alessio closed his eyes, his mind racing. Someone was trying to start a war between the families, and they were using his name to do it. The question was who and why now. Double security on the house, he ordered, and I want every man we have on standby. If this goes sideways... Already done, boss, but there's something else. We think someone's been watching the estate. Tony spotted the same car 3 times this week, different drivers each time. Alessio's grip tightened on the phone. If someone was targeting his family, if they were threatening Eloise... I want that car found and the occupants brought to me, he said, his voice carrying the promise of violence. And Marco, no one gets near this house. No one. When he hung up and returned to the kitchen, he found Clara cleaning up, while Eloise played with Mint at the breakfast nook. Clara looked up as he entered, and her smile faded when she saw his expression. Is everything all right? She asked quietly. Alessio wanted to lie, to protect her from the darkness that was closing in around them. But looking at her concerned face, he realized that she deserved the truth. There may be some complications in the coming days, he said carefully, aware that Eloise was listening. Additional security measures will be put in place. Clara's eyes widened slightly, but she nodded. What kind of complications? The kind that require you and Eloise to stay close to the house for a while, Alessio replied, his jaw tight with suppressed anger. I won't let anything happen to either of you. The promise in his voice was absolute, and Clara felt something shift between them. This wasn't just an employer protecting his staff. This was a man who would burn the world down to keep them safe. Daddy, are the bad men coming? Eloise asked, her voice small and frightened. Alessio knelt down beside her chair, taking her small hands in his much larger ones. No one is going to hurt you. Piccola, I promise. But what if they try? Eloise's eyes filled with tears. What if they take Clara away like they took Mommy? Alessio's heart shattered at the fear in his daughter's voice. Sophia hadn't been taken. She had left willingly, but Eloise was too young to understand the difference. That will never happen, he said fiercely. I will never let anyone take Clara away from you. Clara felt tears prick her eyes at the raw emotion in Alessio's voice. In that moment, she realized that she wasn't just the nanny anymore. She had become part of this family, part of their story, and the thought of leaving them was unbearable. I'm not going anywhere, she said softly, moving to stand beside Alessio. I promised I would stay, and I keep my promises. Eloise looked between the 2 adults who had become her world, and for the first time since her mother's abandonment, she felt truly safe. But outside, in the gathering darkness, enemies were moving closer, and the fragile peace they had built was about to be tested in ways none of them could imagine. The attack came at dawn. Clara woke to the sound of gunfire echoing through the mansion's halls, sharp cracks that shattered the peaceful morning like glass. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she threw on her robe and rushed to Eloise's room, finding the little girl sitting up in bed, clutching Mint with wide, terrified eyes. Clara, Eloise sobbed, reaching for her. The loud noises, they're so scary. I'm here. Sweetheart, Clara whispered, gathering the child in her arms even as her own hands trembled. Everything's going to be okay. But even as she spoke the words, Clara could hear shouting from downstairs, the sound of heavy footsteps and more gunshots. Through Eloise's window, she could see black SUVs in the circular driveway and men in dark clothing moving with military precision. The bedroom door burst open, and Clara's scream died in her throat when she saw Alessio standing there, His white dress shirt was torn and stained with blood, his dark hair disheveled, but his eyes burned with a fury she had never seen before. "We need to move now," he said, his voice deadly calm despite the chaos surrounding them. "Daddy!" Eloise cried, reaching for him. "What's happening?" Alessio crossed the room in 2 strides, taking his daughter from Clara's arms. "Just some bad men who don't know when to quit, Piccola, but Daddy's going to take care of it." "Is that your blood?" Clara asked, noticing the dark stains on his shirt. "Not mine," Alessio replied grimly, "but there are more of them than we anticipated. The safe room. We need to get you both to the safe room." Clara had heard about the safe room but had never seen it. Alessio led them through a hidden door behind a bookshelf in his study, revealing a steel-reinforced chamber equipped with monitors, communications equipment, and enough supplies to last for days. "Stay here," Alessio ordered, setting Eloise down on a small couch. "Don't open this door for anyone but me or Marco. Do you understand?" "You're leaving?" Clara asked, panic rising in her voice. Alessio turned to her, and for a moment his mask slipped. She saw the fear beneath the fury, the desperation of a man who had everything to lose. "I have to end this," he said softly. "They came into my home, they threatened my family." The word family hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Clara realized that somewhere along the way, she had stopped being just the nanny. She had become part of something precious and fragile and worth fighting for. "Come back to us," she whispered, her hand reaching up to touch his face. "Promise me you'll come back." Alessio caught her hand, pressing it against his cheek for a moment that felt like forever. "I promise," he said, his voice rough with emotion. He knelt down to kiss Eloise's forehead. "Be brave for me, Piccola. Take care of Clara." "I will, Daddy," Eloise said solemnly. "But you have to come back and read me a story tonight." "I wouldn't miss it," Alessio replied, his throat tight. As he turned to leave, Clara called out to him, "Alessio?" He looked back, and she saw her own feelings reflected in his dark eyes. Love, fear, and the desperate hope that they would have a chance to explore what was growing between them. "Ti amo," she said softly, the Italian words feeling natural on her tongue. Alessio's breath caught. "Ti amo anch'io," he replied, and then he was gone, sealing them safely inside, while he went to face whatever waited outside. The next 3 hours were the longest of Clara's life. She held Eloise close, singing softly to keep the little girl calm, while her own heart raced with terror. The monitors showed glimpses of the battle raging outside, men moving through the gardens, the flash of gunfire, bodies falling. Through it all, she caught occasional glimpses of Alessio, moving like a force of nature through his enemies. He was magnificent and terrifying, every inch the dangerous man his reputation claimed him to be. But all Clara could think about was the gentleness in his hands when he touched his daughter, the vulnerability in his eyes when he looked at her. Finally, the gunfire stopped. The mansion fell silent except for the sound of sirens in the distance. Clara waited, her heart pounding, until she heard the specific knock Alessio had taught them. 3 short, 2 long, 3 short. She opened the door to find him standing there, alive but battered. His shirt was completely ruined now, and there was a cut above his left eyebrow, but he was breathing, he was whole, he was here. "Daddy!" Eloise launched herself into his arms, and Alessio held her tight, his eyes closing with relief. "It's over, Piccola," he murmured into her hair. "The bad men are gone." "Forever?" Eloise asked. "Forever," Alessio confirmed, and Clara heard the absolute certainty in his voice. Whatever he had done out there, whatever lines he had crossed, he had made sure his family would never be threatened again. As Eloise chattered about how brave she had been, Clara found herself studying Alessio's face. There was something different about him now, something harder and more resolved. The attack had changed him, just as it had changed everything between them. "Clara was brave too," Eloise was saying. "She sang to me and told me stories and didn't cry even once." "Did she?" Alessio's eyes met Clara's over his daughter's head. "She's very special. Our Clara. Our Clara." The possessiveness in his voice sent heat spiraling through her body, even as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. This was his world, violence and danger and enemies who would stop at nothing to destroy what he loved. But as she watched him with Eloise, saw the love and devotion in every gesture, Clara realized that she was already too far gone to care about the danger. She loved them both, this broken man and his precious daughter, and she would face any threat to protect what they had built together. Later that night, after Eloise had finally fallen asleep, Clara found Alessio standing on the balcony outside his bedroom, staring out at the city lights. He had showered and changed into fresh clothes, but she could still see the weight of the day's events in the set of his shoulders. "How many?" she asked softly, joining him at the railing. 12, he replied without looking at her. "All of them." Clara absorbed this information without flinching. 12 men had died today because they had threatened his family, because they had threatened her. "Do you regret it?" she asked. Alessio turned to her then, his dark eyes intense in the moonlight. "I regret that it was necessary. I regret that you and Eloise had to be afraid, but I don't regret protecting what's mine." "What's yours?" Clara repeated, her pulse quickening. Alessio stepped closer, his hand coming up to cup her face. "You," he said simply. "Both of you. You're mine, Clara, and I'm never letting you go." The kiss that followed was desperate and hungry, full of the fear they had both carried and the relief of survival. Clara melted against him, her hands fisting in his shirt as she poured all of her love and terror and hope into the connection between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Alessio rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said, the words raw and honest. "I know it's complicated. I know my world is dangerous, but—" "I love you too," Clara interrupted, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "And I'm not going anywhere. You're stuck with me, Alessio Mancini." As they stood there in the moonlight, holding each other close, neither of them noticed the small figure watching from the doorway. Eloise smiled sleepily, clutching Mint to her chest before padding back to her room. For the first time in her young life, she felt completely safe. Her daddy loved Clara, and Clara loved them back, and that meant her family was finally complete. The monsters didn't stand a chance. 6 months later, the Mancini estate had been transformed into something that resembled an actual home rather than a fortress. The gardens bloomed with flowers that Eloise and Clara had planted together, and the sound of laughter echoed through rooms that had been silent for too long. The threat from the Kozlov family had been eliminated permanently, along with the traitor within Alessio's own organization who had orchestrated the frame job. Victor's real killer, an ambitious underboss named Sergei Petrov, who had wanted to start a war for his own gain, had been dealt with in the traditional manner. The remaining Russian leadership had been more than happy to maintain the peace once they learned the truth. But for all the external changes, the most profound transformation had happened within the walls of the mansion itself. Alessio had learned to leave his work at the office, to be present for bedtime stories and breakfast conversations and all the small moments that made up a family's life. Clara had found her place not just as Eloise's caregiver, but as the heart of their home. And Eloise. Eloise had blossomed into the confident, joyful child she was always meant to be. It was a Saturday morning when everything came full circle. Clara was in the kitchen making pancakes, heart-shaped ones that had become Eloise's favorite, when she heard familiar footsteps on the marble stairs. "Something smells incredible," Alessio said, appearing in the doorway. He was dressed casually in jeans and a white button-down shirt, the top 4 buttons undone as always, revealing the strong column of his throat and the edge of his tattoo. His platinum Rolex caught the morning light as he reached for the coffee she had already prepared. "Daddy!" Eloise came running in, still in her princess pajamas, Mint tucked under one arm. "Clara's making the special pancakes." "Is she?" Alessio lifted his daughter onto his hip, pressing a kiss to her dark curls. "And what makes them special?" "They're made with love," Eloise said seriously, repeating something Clara had told her weeks ago. "That's the most important ingredient." Alessio's eyes met Clara's over Eloise's head, and the look that passed between them was full of warmth and promise, and the kind of love that had grown slowly, carefully, built on trust and shared devotion to the little girl in his arms. "Love is definitely the most important ingredient," Clara agreed, flipping a pancake with practiced ease, in pancakes and in everything else. As they sat down to breakfast together, Eloise chattering about her plans for the day, Clara marveled at how normal it all felt. How right. 6 months ago, she had been a woman with no family, no real home, just a job caring for other people's children. Now she was part of something beautiful and precious and permanent. "Clara," Eloise said suddenly, syrup sticky on her chin, "can I ask you something?" "Of course, sweetheart. What is it?" Eloise looked between Clara and her father, her expression unusually serious for a 5-year-old. "Are you going to marry Daddy?" Clara nearly choked on her coffee, while Alessio went completely still. They had talked about the future in vague terms, about love and commitment and building a life together, but marriage hadn't been explicitly discussed. "Eloise," Alessio said carefully, "that's a very grown-up question." "But I want to know," Eloise insisted, "because if you marry Clara, then she'll really be my mommy, right? Not just my nanny who I love like a mommy?" Clara felt tears prick her eyes at the hope in the little girl's voice. "Eloise, I love you like you're my own daughter no matter what. Marriage doesn't change that. But it would make it official," Eloise said with the logic of a child, "and then you could never leave, because mommies and daddies stay together forever." Alessio reached across the table to take Clara's hand, his thumb stroking across her knuckles. "What do you think, amore mio? Should we make it official?" Clara's breath caught at the endearment, at the question in his dark eyes. "Alessio, I know it's not the most romantic proposal," he said with a slight smile, "but our daughter seems to think it's a good idea." "Our daughter," Clara repeated, her heart swelling at the words. "She's been yours since the first night you chased away her monsters," Alessio said softly. "Just like you've been mine since the moment you walked into my study and turned my world upside down." Clara looked at Eloise, who was watching them with bright, hopeful eyes, then back at Alessio, the man who had taught her that love could bloom even in the darkest places. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I'll marry you." Eloise let out a squeal of delight and launched herself across the table into Clara's arms. "I'm going to have a real mommy, and we're going to be a real family." "We already are a real family," Clara said, holding the little girl tight, while Alessio's hand squeezed hers. "We have been for a long time." Later that evening, after Eloise had been tucked into bed with promises of wedding planning and dress shopping, Clara and Alessio sat together in the library where they had shared so many quiet moments over the past months. "I have something for you," Alessio said, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. "I've been carrying it around for weeks, waiting for the right moment." He opened the box to reveal a stunning diamond ring, elegant and classic with a vintage setting that was absolutely perfect. "It was my grandmother's," he said as he slipped it onto her finger. "She would have loved you. She always said that the right woman could tame even the wildest Mancini heart." "I don't want to tame you," Clara said, admiring the way the ring caught the firelight. "I love you exactly as you are." "Even the dangerous parts?" Alessio asked, his voice serious. Clara turned to face him fully, her hands framing his face. "Especially the dangerous parts. They're what make you who you are, a man who would do anything to protect his family." "Our family," Alessio corrected, pulling her closer. "Our family," Clara agreed, and when he kissed her, she tasted forever on his lips. From upstairs came the sound of Eloise's voice, talking to Mint about wedding dresses and flower girls and all the wonderful things that were coming. For the first time since her mother had abandoned her, the little girl fell asleep without fear, surrounded by the certainty that she was loved and wanted and would never be alone again. The monsters had been defeated, not by force or violence, but by something far more powerful, the love of a family that had found each other against all odds and chosen to stay together no matter what the world might throw at them. And in the master bedroom of the Mancini estate, as Clara fell asleep in Alessio's arms, she knew that she had finally found her home, not in a place but in the hearts of the man and child who had become her everything. The nanny who had come to chase away a little girl's nightmares had ended up healing them all. Years had passed since that first terrifying night when Eloise's screams had echoed through the mansion halls. The little girl who had once been afraid of shadows had grown into a confident 8-year-old, who faced the world with the fearlessness that came from knowing she was unconditionally loved. Clara stood in the doorway of what had once been Eloise's nursery, now transformed into a bright, cheerful bedroom for their newest addition. Baby Marco slept peacefully in his crib, his tiny fist curled against his cheek, completely oblivious to the legacy of love and protection that surrounded him. "He looks like you when he sleeps," Clara said softly as Alessio joined her, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind. "Poor kid," Alessio murmured against her hair, making her laugh quietly. "Mama? Papa? Come quick!" Eloise's voice called from downstairs, excitement bubbling over. "The cake is ready." They made their way to the kitchen where Eloise stood proudly beside a slightly lopsided but beautifully decorated cake. She had insisted on making it herself for their 3rd wedding anniversary, with only minimal help from the household staff. "It's perfect, tesoro," Clara said, using the Italian endearment that had become natural over the years. "Absolutely perfect." As they sat together around the kitchen table, the same table where Eloise had once asked if Clara would marry her daddy, Clara marveled at how far they had all come. Alessio had gradually transitioned much of his business operations to legitimate enterprises, though he still maintained the respect and influence that came with the Mancini name. Eloise excelled in school and had never had another nightmare since Clara became her mother in every way that mattered. "Tell the story, Mama," Eloise said as Clara cut the cake. "Tell the story about how you came to save me from the monsters." It had become a family tradition, this retelling of how they had found each other. Clara smiled, settling back in her chair as Alessio's hand found hers. "Once upon a time," she began, "there was a little girl who was very brave, but sometimes the shadows in her room seemed too big and too scary." As Clara wove the familiar tale, transforming their real-life struggles into something magical and hopeful, Alessio watched his wife and daughter with wonder. The woman who had walked into his study with nothing but compassion and determination had given him everything he had never dared to dream of: a real family, genuine happiness, and the kind of love that made even the darkest corners of his world seem bright. "And they all lived happily ever after," Clara finished as she always did. "The end," Eloise announced with satisfaction. "But not really the end, because we're still living it." "That's right, Piccola," Alessio said, pulling both his girls close. "We're still living our happily ever after." Later that night, after Eloise had been tucked into bed with Mint, who was now showing his age but remained her faithful companion, and baby Marco had been fed and settled, Clara and Alessio sat together on their bedroom balcony, looking out over the city lights. "Do you ever regret it?" Clara asked, her head resting on his shoulder. "Giving up the old life for this?" Alessio was quiet for a moment, considering. "The old life gave me power," he said finally. "But this life gave me purpose. I'd choose purpose every time." Clara smiled, turning in his arms to face him. Even after all these years, the sight of him still made her heart race. The strong line of his jaw, the intensity of his dark eyes, the way his white shirt fell open at the collar, revealing the tattoo that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. "I love you, Alessio Mancini," she said, the words as true now as they had been that first night she had spoken them. "Ti amo anch'io, mia bella moglie," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Forever and always." As they kissed under the starlight, the sounds of their sleeping children drifting from the rooms nearby, Clara knew that she had found something rarer than diamonds, more precious than gold. A love that had conquered fear, healed old wounds, and created something beautiful from the ashes of broken dreams. The nanny had stayed, just as she had promised, and in staying she had discovered that sometimes the greatest adventures begin not with leaving, but with choosing to build a home in the most unexpected places, with the most unlikely people, creating a family bound not by blood, but by choice, commitment, and the kind of love that makes monsters disappear forever. In the master bedroom of the Mancini estate, surrounded by the peaceful sounds of their children's breathing and the steady beat of her husband's heart, Clara Mancini fell asleep with a smile on her face, knowing that tomorrow would bring new adventures, new joys, and the continued blessing of a life built on love. The monsters had been defeated long ago. In their place lived only light, laughter, and the promise of forever, What an incredible journey of love, healing, and family. Clara's courage to stay and fight for Eloise's happiness led to a beautiful transformation for everyone involved. Love truly does conquer all, even in the most unexpected circumstances. If this story touched your heart, please give it a thumbs up and let us know in the comments which moment made you believe in their love story. Don't forget to subscribe to Passion and Power for more heartwarming tales of romance and redemption. Until next time, keep believing in the power of love.